Welcome to Tales of Britain and Ireland. This is a podcast telling the stories, legends and folktales of Britain and Ireland in no particular order. Presented by Graham and coming direct from South Yorkshire, each episode tells a story or selection of stories from all across these islands and throughout their history, followed by a short and decidedly inexpert discussion of the origin and themes of each tale. And indeed, welcome back everyone. Now it has been a very long time since my last episode, so I'm not going to give you some sort of rambly preamble here. You don't deserve that. You're here for the stories. I will just say that if you are interested in following me anywhere, I'm now on Blue Sky and not on that other place anymore. But without further ado, let's get into a story. This is The Knife Against the Wave. She was a woman with needs, with wants, with desires. And with her power and position, so many of them could be so easily fulfilled with a wave of the hand almost. Riches beyond the dreams of almost everyone else. So of course, naturally, she became bored with all of this and instead focused on those things that she could not have so easily. That involved bending the will of others to her way. She wanted it all, and she was accustomed to having it all, and everything that she wanted would be hers. I'm going to start this story some 20 years in the future, because that's how I do things around here. When the second curragh came back to shore, its nets equally full to bursting with silvery blue salmon and herring, and more fish too outside of those nets, thrashing around wildly in the bottom of the boat. There they had hurled themselves with seemingly suicidal intent. Well, then it became apparent that something very special indeed was happening out in the bay. Those who came back said the ocean was brimming full of life that they'd never seen before. Barely the water itself could be made out between the glistening bodies at its surface. The fishermen could literally reach off the side of the boat and grab huge handfuls of fish. This was an opportunity unlike any other in this desperately poor village, a sea's bounty richer than any of them had ever imagined. Almost everyone with any fishing experience was working the boats now, with the rest of the villagers on the shores, unloading the catch from the curraghs, the small wooden boats, and beginning the process of preparing the fish, planning how they would store it or take it to the nearest markets. Wealth quite unparalleled seemed to be on offer to them. There was far more out there for the easy taking than they could ever cope with. Who knew how long this would last? All other concerns of the day were set aside. The small community pulled together and focused. More fishermen were needed as those who had been out began to tire. But here, there weren't many with the know-how to take their place. It all rested on a handful of men. Though there was one man who had been out to sea, who, while doing his part, gutting and packing and curing the masses of fish, he was not out there on the boats. And as the day dragged on and on, Seamus heard his name mentioned by the villagers around him. Seamus was a fisherman, wasn't he? A good one, too. One of the best, an old man confirmed. No one directly asked him, but the snatches of conversation he accidentally overheard became more frequent as the hour got later. And when it became clear that a curragh freshly emptied of its catch was going to be left on the shore while it waited for a man to take it out, Seamus stood up from his current task, looked out upon the bay, and he could see that strange phenomenon even from the shore, the mass of fish leaping in and out of the gentle waves. Such was the volume of them that it looked like some oddly writhing carpet had been laid atop the ocean. He knew that his community needed him. They expected of him. He gave a deep sigh, and he headed towards the boat. It was 20 years or so earlier. The day was clear and bright. The sea was calm, not teeming with tons of seafood intent upon offering itself up as a sacrifice. But a fine day, not to be wasted for the fishermen in this small village on the rocky shore of Corcagrinia. Nice day for fishing, ain't it, as they say. It mattered not a jot to them that Seamus, a young man at this time, was to be married the very next day. They were all poor and the catch was much needed. And surely him going out today, making a great catch perhaps, would in no way affect his ability to make his way to the chapel tomorrow for a ceremony and then a great big party. How could it? Ominous foreshadowing. And anyway, he always took care to be safe on the water. The rituals he engaged in had become habitual, unconscious, operating on autopilot and muscle memory, as we might say today. As he looked out at the sea as the sun peeked over the horizon and he headed to the shore, he barely paid attention to all the things that he did. Though today, on the eve of his wedding, he needed to stay safe perhaps more than ever. But he was prepared. He'd put on his heaviest boots to walk to the harbour. He'd made sure that his boat wasn't going to be the first out. As he left home, his mother threw a piece of turf after him. She did not call him back to the house. He had a hand in his pocket, fingers grasping the piece of coal he'd brought with him. He met no fire-haired woman on the way to the shore. Luckily, his own red-headed fiancée did not meet him. And he sighted no priests, though the local priest was of course very well versed in this particular superstition, and so tended to avoid walking on the shore at this hour for fear of the damage that he could do the catch. When Seamus arrived at the boat and met his two fellow fishermen for the day, they entered from the right-hand side, and they all made sure not to use those words, in Irish of course, pig, hare, rabbit, cat, fox or salmon. Though it was of course impossible to avoid discussion of such animals, can you imagine? But his companion, when recounting a humorous story about his very own pig, referred to the animal as the curly-tailed fellow, and potential ill luck was thus neatly sidestepped. There was no whistling, hard as its allure was to resist, and they checked that the piece of turf was in its place at the bottom of the boat before setting off. Alongside all this, there was the preparation with the ropes and the nets and checking the boat over and making sure they had the right clothes and tools with them. All that relatively easy, unimportant stuff. The May morning remained fine, and they were soon near the fishing spots. The men soon fell to talking about the upcoming wedding. Some light ribbing of Seamus occurred, he rather nervous about the occasion and trying not to show it. The older of his companions gave him some rather graphic advice, backed up by hand motions, and there was raucous laughter from the little boat. Spirits were high. The fish were not exactly forthcoming, seeming to want to avoid their deaths at least the usual amount, but enough failed in this endeavour to make it a better than average but in no way remarkable sort of day. But as morning turned to afternoon, the men ate their lunches, though sadly the men lacked the gaudy plastic lunchboxes embossed with their personally most beloved animated movie character. Mine was the genie from Aladdin, if you're wondering. It was unfortunate that they lacked such, but they never knew what they were missing out on, so they couldn't be as sad about it as possibly they should be. As they ate that lunch, the weather made a very sudden change for the worst. The sea is a notoriously cruel and fickle mistress, so this wasn't something new to them. But that morning Seamus knew he'd done everything right, so it seemed most unfair that today, of all days, this could happen. Perhaps it was one of his companions who had erred. You never could be quite sure who had broken the taboos, though surely someone had, because they had to work, right? The winds picked up, the sky darkened threateningly. The waters became rough and choppy. There were cold white flecks on the wavelets that raised up around the creaking vessel, which now seemed tiny in comparison to the vast ocean. They had seen worse, though maybe not in May, and all three of them took to the oars and rowed hard for shore, the narrow blades designed exactly for such conditions. They would be fine. Nothing to worry about. Fish writhed in the nets as the boat was raised up and down. The waves crashed around them. The wind was howling so much they had to shout to be heard. But they kept their calm. All three were experienced boatsmen, even Seamus. Though the youngest, he had been brought up on the sea, and he was strong, and he had an even better reason than usual to make sure they got home. Row! 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 They were making good progress towards the shore. It seemed certain that they would make it, when the waters behind them began to swell alarmingly, rising higher and higher, forming into a great wave that seemed to come from nowhere at all. A wave that was as wide and tall as a mountain, that seemed set on pursuing the tiny boat. A roaring wall of water that would engulf them, smashing their vessels to smithereens and surely drowning them all. Row! And they rowed like they never rowed before. They turned in the water, and the wave turned with the boat. And now they knew that something was wrong. There was no longer any pretending that this was a natural wave. This was something else. Seamus gripped the piece of coal in his pocket, but to his horror, it crumbled in his hands. One man let go of an oar to reach down to the piece of turf in the bottom of the boat, the piece of land that they carried with them that would, in theory at least, ensure that they returned to that very same land. He picked it up, held it tight as the wave towered over them. The power of the turf seemed as nothing. It didn't look like it was going to work on this occasion. This was it. The men stood, stared up, and then it all happened within moments that seemed stretched to eternity, as coal crumbling. Seamus found in his pocket his knife, the knife he always carried, his black-handled knife, his Scian dove, and in one last futile gesture he threw the knife as hard as he could into the oncoming wave. If you'd asked him why he'd done it, he couldn't have given you an answer. It was more an expression of rage and fear at the unfairness of a cruel, nonsensical world that was to take him away just on the cusp of the rest of his life beginning. The knife whirled round and round in the air, and it was the blade that hit the wave dead in the centre, and the great tower of water first split in two right down the middle, as if it were tissue paper ripped apart, and then the two remaining halves of the waves fell directly downwards, gravity claiming the waters immediately with a vengeance, as if it had just noticed them again, and noticed they should never have been a wave. It pulled them swiftly back into the ocean. The power of that sudden descent was enough to cause smaller waves that rose up under the boat, knocked Seamus from his feet, and threatened to overturn it. But after a ropey moment or two, as the swell passed under them, the men found their boat bobbing gently, and then coming to a stop on a glass-still sea. And above them was a blue, cloudless sky. They returned to shore immediately, thankful for Seamus's quick thinking, though quite unable to explain what had happened. And his quick thinking had really been nothing of the sort, a crazy desperation rather, that somehow had seemingly paid off. All the men knew that something very strange, very wrong had happened out on that water. But they made it back alive despite the very obvious ominous foreshadowing I introduced earlier in the story. They were fine. They took what fish they had back and decided they'd risk it no longer on this day. They said no more about it and parted when the work was done on shore, and by that time their spirits were well back up again, buoyed by their survival, and that the very next day they would meet again at Seamus's wedding. The young man returned to the house he shared with his mother. It had, by any standard, been a momentous day, and exhaustion won out against any nerves at his upcoming nuptials. So almost as soon as it was dark, he was in a dreamless sleep. Now Seamus's mother, a widow about to witness her only son's marriage, she did not go to sleep early. There were many, many preparations still to just put the very last touches to. That could be done by candlelight only, and candles were very expensive, but this was an evening that warranted one. so she was still awake and working busily when she heard the sound of hoofbeats slowly approaching along the stony path that led from their house to the sea. This was a most unexpected sound, an ominous one too. Their little house did not attract the attention of those who would come by horse, and those who would come by horse at night, well, she had no idea what sort of people those were, but they were surely a dangerous and unwanted sort. The widow paused in her workings, listened as the hoofbeats stopped, and there was the clatter of a rider dismounting. She could have refused to open the door, but it would deter no one truly determined, and so instead, a moment before the inevitable knock, she opened it up, so that Seamus was not disturbed by the sound. A man stood at the door, a man dressed more finely than any she had seen before. Though clouds obscured the moon, light still caught, reflected off the glittering filigree in which he was bedecked, and behind him his tall horse shone almost as white as the winter snows. The strange man was very direct. With no introduction or any other words spoken, he simply asked, "Is Seamus here?" "He is not." The man gave a gentle, lilting laugh. It was a turn of phrase only. "I know he is asleep in his bed. You will fetch him for me." Now, Seamus's mother was probably not as old as you are picturing. I think the word widow tends to summon up the idea of a fairly elderly woman, perhaps except in those bizarrely sexy, "she definitely murdered him" Scottish widow adverts. But it is those that are rather more accurate in this case. People married young back then. She was perhaps 35 at the oldest, but nevertheless, despite an age that would seem positively youthful today, she had accrued in her life a great deal of experience and wisdom. Anybody questioning that statement about whether 35 is really considered positively youthful these days, by the way? Well, you probably aren't a few months away from 40, so just let me have it. Positively youthful at 35. No comments, please. Now, the widow had never encountered a man like this before, but she knew what he was all right. And she had her wits about her, but she was under no illusion that if he really wanted her son, she could do anything to stop him. So she relented. She went to wake Seamus. He probably thought he was being woken up for his wedding. Very tired indeed. But only an hour or two had actually passed. And no doubt he was very confused. This was a very, very trying day. So Seamus stumbles blearily eyed into the main room of their small cottage to see this fabulously adorned, glittering, overly flamboyant gentleman projecting an energy that was sort of at Slay Queen levels into the darkened room, literally lighting it up brighter than any candle. "Yes," said Seamus, rubbing his bleary eyes. "You must come with me, now." "He can't do that. He's to be married tomorrow," said Seamus's mother, which Seamus, sort of taking her direction, followed up with a bit of a helpless, apologetic shrug. A shrug that aimed to give the impression that if it wasn't for the wedding, well, he'd be all for riding off with a strange, flashy gent who turned up unannounced in his house in the middle of the night. But what can I do? A polite lie of a shrug. But that wasn't where it ended. "You don't understand. It was you who was on the sea earlier. It was you who threw the knife into the wave." "Yes?" His mother watched the man carefully, thinking. The man reached out to Seamus imploringly. "Then it is only you who can save the life of my mistress. But you must come with me. She needs you now." Seamus said it himself now. "But I'm to be married tomorrow. I can't go anywhere." "I don't think you understand me," said the dazzling man. "A woman's life hangs in the balance. She will die if you do not come with me tonight. You must." And then, looking really quite awkward as he said it, he added, "Please." Seamus shared a glance with his mother. If what the stranger said was true, if a woman's life was truly in danger, then surely he must go. She could see the conflicted expression in his eyes, knew what her good son intended. But cogs were whirring in the young widow's head, for there was something about this situation that was unusual. I mean, more unusual than just the situation itself. Rather, she picked up an unexpected undercurrent. Let's cut to the chase, she thought. This man was clearly not of their world. He was from the other place. This was one of the Doini Maha, the She, no human man. And she had heard much about such folk, not only by listening to episodes 40 and 41 of Tales of Britain and Ireland. No, she didn't need that. For she had grown up, like everyone else here, constantly aware of their invisible presence, unseen but certainly not unfelt. The stories, the warnings, the rules, all of them were almost as familiar to her as the seasons of the tides on the rocky shore. And those She were just as dangerous as the tides, and though less predictable, they still did follow rules, just as the sea did. And this man wasn't quite acting how she had been led to believe his type would. And then it clicked. In his own way, he was begging them. He needed Seamus to agree, to go willingly. Surely it should be in his power to extract whatever he desired, but it seemed not. And if truly he couldn't force Seamus, then perhaps there was a bargain to be struck. The good people put great weight in promises. "You will save her life, won't you?" the man was saying. And Seamus relented. "If you speak truly and she will die without my help, then of course I will, but I can't imagine why any woman's life could depend on me. I mean, damn it, I'm a fisherman, not a doctor." "You'll see. Come with me now." The man turned to leave, Seamus behind him, and at this his mother spoke up. "Aye, if there's a lass needs him, he'll go. But if he is truly needed, then you'll have no problem promising you'll bring him back here in time for his wedding, and safe and sound as he is now. Promise to that he'll suffer no harm at the hands of you or your kind, or any other harm which is within your power to prevent when he's with you." The man turned, flashed her a look that just for an instant seemed to show a deep anger, but which quickly disappeared, transformed into an instant into one of conciliation, understanding. Seamus paused, and his mother and him both waited for the man to speak. "Of course, wise widow. He'll not be harmed by me or any of our folk, come to no harm in fact, and freely able to choose the time of his return. I swear it to you here." There could still be some trickery in there, she knew it. But she'd done what she could, and now Seamus was out of the door, into the moonlight night, leaving his mother behind him. She stood in the doorway of the cottage, watching as her son mounted up behind the stranger, and then that mighty white charger took off, running directly towards the sea. The light of the full moon was so strong that she could still see them perfectly as the horse reached the shore, and there made no attempt to slow down as it ran straight into the black waves, which rather than splash seemed to part around it, and the horse slid under the sea as smoothly and naturally as a sword entering a scabbard. And they were gone. If Seamus had had longer to think about it, then he might have been screaming by the time he entered the water. But he barely had time to take in what was happening. Horses didn't go into water after all. It just wasn't what happened. And his brain was telling him the creature would definitely have to stop and turn soon. And when it finally registered that it just wasn't going to, well then his reactions compensated by making him take a huge breath of nighttime air at the very last instant, just before him, horse and rider plunged beneath the waves. Seamus was a fisherman. From a very early age, he had fallen in the sea. He had fallen in the sea quite a lot over the years, sometimes on purpose, quite a lot of the time not. He knew the biting cold, the taste of salt, the darkness under the waves at night. He knew exactly what to expect. He'd likely been in this very patch of sea numerous times, but everything was different. He barely felt wet. As the horse galloped, there was only the slightest resistance of the waters around him, waters that were a brilliant cerulean. He looked up and he could see the top of the ocean above him, the water-distorted moon far above that, its brightness seeming to penetrate the whole ocean as light as day. The sea bed was not as it should be. The horse was taking a gravelly path that made its way through a waving green forest of Hyperborean kelps, a path he swore was not there normally. He had never seen the seaweed woods looking quite like this before. He also sort of noticed that neither he nor his shining companion were floating off the horse, and the horse was galloping down a path on the sea bed, which shouldn't be the case were the conventional laws of physics being obeyed. But they were very much not, having apparently decided to take the evening off, getting some much-needed rest, ordering a pizza, putting on a film, probably Gravity. Seamus was overwhelmed trying to take all this in, when his body started insisting he really needed to get some more air now. And he couldn't hold it in any longer, and his mouth opened and, well, you know that he breathed easily, even as the water poured into his mouth, down his throat, into his lungs. A feeling that, in stark contrast to all other times that he had felt that, was strangely relaxing, like a pleasantly warm bath for his insides. He tried to formulate a question but stumbled, came out with just how, what, and the sounds travelled freely in the water in a way they certainly should not. The man in front turned his head briefly, gave Seamus a look that was all rolled eyes and successfully conveyed, "Bloody tourists. Just hold on, we'll be there soon," the annoyance in his voice tinged with anxiety. And Seamus fell silent as the impossible midnight ride under the sea continued. They weren't there as soon as he would have liked. Seamus was silent for an hour or two. The only sound was the definitely didn't make any sense at all thundering of the tireless horse's hooves, and the far distant calls of whales and dolphins. And despite all these marvels, Seamus was given ample time to consider, and worry soon began to set in. Worried that despite the promises extracted by his sharp-witted mother, his return for his wedding tomorrow might not be quite as certain as had been claimed. He distracted himself by gazing in awe at the shoals of fish. Fish were his life. He thought he knew them rather better than the back of his own hand, but yet here, where he could observe them like never before, the vast herring shoals that moved in a perfect synchronized union, as though but cells in some vast single creature. They filled the underwater world in every direction, seeming to go on forever. As far as he could see, the ocean was packed with silvery bodies. Watching their movements was so compelling, hypnotic even, that it took quite a while before he began to notice the figures that could occasionally be seen around the base of the kelp. Dark, humanoid figures, caught out of the corner of the eye that dissipated into the waters like a fog when he tried to look at them directly. While everything else, the seabed, the fish, the seaweed, was an unfamiliar twist on a world he was very familiar with, these figures did not belong to his experience at all. They weren't common, but every now and then he would glimpse one, and occasionally it seemed to Seamus that they saw him too, turned slightly to the horse, shadow faces watching, the occasional arm reaching out. It was deeply unnerving, and he was just about to ask his companion of them when they passed one, lurking within strands of kelp. And this time Seamus could make out features on the face as the figure lurched towards them. And there was a jolt of recognition. He knew that face, had known it, even though it was strange and warped, but even so, that was one of the older fishermen from the village, the fisherman who had first taken Seamus out in his boat when he was but a boy, let him play at joining his crew. a man who had tragically died in the great storm some 5 years ago. Seamus gasped in recognition as the horse left the man behind, standing in the path, arms reaching out imploringly. "Pay them no heed," said the rider. "We are almost there." As they crested a rise, the ocean floor fell away in front of them and revealed a palace. A huge palace sitting on the sea floor. And yes, you already know what a sea floor palace looks like, all decorated with corals and shells and pearls and shoals of fish swimming around its lofty sunken turrets. I mean, probably that's what it looked like. I wasn't there, and descriptions of it are actually quite hard to come by. Quite possibly I'm just projecting my idea of what an underwater palace should look like, from seeing them in mermaid movies, but more pertinently from seeing them in fish tanks, and then I'm jumping to wrong conclusions. Stereotyping, if you will. Quite possibly it looked nothing like that at all. Instead, maybe reflected a design more in keeping with the ancient palaces of the Tuatha Dé Danann, whose connection with these ocean dwellers is unclear, but certainly exists. But regardless of how it actually appeared, it was more grand than just some little hideaway beneath the waves. They rode straight for the palace's main gate, which was opened without delay by guards as wonderfully adorned as the rider. Their weapons alone glinted and glittered as though they emitted their very own light. Through a courtyard they went, where horses and octopuses mingled together, and there they dismounted, and Seamus was led into the interior of that palace, through a vast corridor of immense beauty studded with all the jewels of land and sea alike, until the huge doors of a throne room were opened up before him. It probably goes without saying, but I do want to emphasise how mind-blowing this was for Seamus. He'd never seen a regular palace before in real life. Possibly the small chapel in his village was in fact the biggest building he'd ever set eyes on. Anything larger was known only to him from a Shanakee's tale and was equally improbable. And now, here he was, day before his wedding day, seeing this very palace under the sea, having just seen the shade of his dead mentor, and all for reasons that he did not understand. Except that it was apparently all to save the life of someone he had never met. Oh, and of course, this was not only the night before his wedding, but on a day where he'd almost drowned if he hadn't somehow split a wave in two with a knife. It was, by any standards, the sort of day that doesn't come about very often. And by now, Seamus was, possibly, quite overwhelmed. But as they entered the throne room, his gaze was drawn to the figure. The woman slumped in that great sea throne. Probably decorated with corals and shells and stuff. You know how it is. It was to her that they headed. This queen, he assumed? She was young, and she did not look well, her eyes just barely flickering open at the sound of the two approaching. "The Queen," said the rider, "you must help her." And she, in turn, raised a jewelled hand weakly, gestured the man away, his part now done. "Seamus," she said, opening her eyes fully with obvious effort. You came for me." And she smiled. And that smile, her face. It's a cliché in stories, and yet there could be no denying that this was the face of the most beautiful woman that Seamus had ever cast eyes on. That very thought rose fully formed and unbidden in his head. And this was without being even able to make out her body, which was covered in a great cloak, ornate, fish-scale embroidered, somehow not wet through, despite the fact that this is all still happening underwater. She was impossibly beautiful. Even if this fisherman had ever seen supermodels before, which he had very much not, then he would still find them wanting by comparison. This was undoubtedly the most beautiful woman that there ever had been, or ever would be. Now, I know some of you will object to this on purely practical grounds, and I'm minded to agree with you. Beauty is not some existent property within the world that may be measured objectively. Beauty, quite famously, lies within the eye of the beholder and varies widely from person to person. And besides, it's not even to an individual person, beauty is strictly comparable. There's not some numeric scale in which an individual's appreciation of beauty can be weighed or counted as an absolute valuation of this beauty over that beauty made. It's all broad categorizations with no final, this is the top value, even if we were to accept some standard metrics of measurement, which is basically a nonsensical starter. The most beautiful is fundamentally an incoherent idea. And this is all true. Yet weighed against all this rationalisation was the knowledge, firm and fixed in Seamus's mind, willed there as if by magic, quite possibly in fact by magic, that this queen was the most beautiful woman. It was as true and solid as the earth itself. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, she seemed to have some sort of similar feelings about him.
You really are so handsome. So, And quite a lot of Seamus liked how the weakened woman was complimenting him and regarding him, almost drinking him in. I have a problem though, Seamus, and you are the only one who can help. You'd like to help me, wouldn't you? Now the other part of Seamus, the smaller part, that wasn't quite sure about how she seemed to be almost hungrily sizing him up. It was that bit of him that made his answer less gushing with a desperate desire to please than it might have been. It urged him to caution. He listened to that part of his mind. Queen, I came to help because I was told a woman was in danger and needed me. I'd come to help anyone. Of course you would. Sweet thing, what a kind-hearted, good boy you are. Let's see what you can do for me then. And with a great effort she reached down and flung the cloak off of her body. And with it came a shower of blood, droplets that drifted through the water that Seamus had almost forgotten they were in. They did so with a strange, slow motion, colouring the space between the two of them a deep red. The black knife handle stuck out of her breast. The blade sunk deep into her. Your knife, I believe. How? Asked Seamus, immediately flooded with guilt. How could he have done this to her? But of course, he could never have known this when he threw that knife. You cast your blade true into that wave, Seamus. A most excellent throw. I was not expecting that. But I should have, of course. You're so strong, fierce, brave.
Seamus stared silently at her for a moment or two as he pieced it together.
It was you, in the wave. Were you trying to kill me? To kill you? Oh, no, never. And her voice was so full of genuine shock and hurt that he believed her. No, I wanted you to be with me, to take you, bring you here. I've been watching you for a long while, Seamus. I wanted to bring us together. I sent the wave so that could happen, for I'm in love with you, Seamus. You are a gorgeous human, strong, caring, clever. I've watched you fish and seen how you man the boats. I adore you. You had to know. I needed you. I wanted you.
She collapsed back onto the throne.
Seamus stared, couldn't really process the words he was hearing. It was all too much, this beautiful woman in love with him. But that is no matter, for despite all that, I underestimated you, thought you still perhaps just another human. I should have known, I wouldn't have fallen for just another lowly human. So you defended yourself, but now there's this. She indicated the knife protruding from her bosom. Her breaths were getting shorter. She was clearly having trouble speaking. Iron in my chest. No more than I deserve, I know. You didn't know. But now I have not long left. Seamus tried to put aside all the bits about her love for him, just concentrate on helping her out. Why don't you take it out? Well, you see, funny thing, I can't. No one here can. In fact, the only person who can take the knife out of me is the person who plunged it in, so you see, that's why you're here. She looked at him imploringly. Will you do it? Will you pull it out? Of course I will. And she responded with a smile that near on melted his brain. He stepped forward. But wait, she held up a hand. You must pull it out in one movement, all the way. For if it is not removed in a single smooth stroke, then it will be lodged so that even your strong hands cannot remove it. A single stroke. Right, he nodded. A single stroke. He reached down and he grasped the dark black haft firmly. She looked up at him, breaths coming in faster. He steadied himself, readying for it. Their eyes met. Are you ready? He asked. I'm ready. Do it, she pleaded. Do it. And in one smooth, powerful motion he pulled the knife from out of her. Her eyes widened. She gasped. Now put your hands on the wound. Hold them there to seal it. She grabbed one of his hands, brought it to her breast. The knife was dropped into the water around them, and it didn't clatter to the floor but floated away, blood droplets spiralling off of it. And she grasped his other hand too, held it to her tightly. For a moment the hands were locked together, pressed against her heaving bosom, she holding them there, keeping his gaze. Yes, she sighed deeply. That's it. That's it. And then after what seemed like an eternity, slowly, slowly, she lifted her hands, took his away. Thank you. And there, where there should have been a bloody great wound, there was nothing. Nothing but smooth, soft, inviting, bare skin with ne'er a mark on it. Seamus gulped. A moment or two passed in silence, and then she sat up. All her energy seemed restored. Thank you, Seamus, thank you so much. And now you are here. You can stay with me. You must stay with me. How fortuitous we can still be wed, you and me, my love. You saved my life. She stood up, and she was so close to him, her lips just a quick motion away and clearly being offered up for him to take. And Seamus, hot-blooded male that he was, stepped backwards. Lady, I'm flattered, of course, but I'm to be married in the morning. So soon? Yes, of course, we can do that. Married to another, he said firmly. I've done what I need to do. I must return to her tonight. Seamus, you do not have to do this. I wish to do this. And he said the words, even though he didn't quite believe them, but he was a good man and true to the woman he had promised himself to. You don't want all of this. She gestured at herself and the palace and took a step towards him. All of this can be yours, my love. You deserve it. What could she possibly have that I do not? What could your life possibly be with her? A life without me, without this? And Seamus was young, but he, I think, understood the distinction between love and pure lust. No, he said, trying to make very clear his intention in the face of her refusal to understand the basic rules of consent. I am leaving. And a crueler look crossed her face now. Well, you'll change your mind when you see what I have to offer. I promise you, you will want to stay here after you've been here a while. I'm leaving right now, he said. No, you are not. You are staying. You will learn to love me. Seamus looked around for the exquisitely dressed gentleman who had brought him here, who seemed to be trying exceptionally hard not to meet Seamus's gaze. But some force that Seamus's mother had understood eventually compelled him to speak up, despite the look upon his face clearly indicating that he would rather be using his mouth to chew on glass. He instead opened it to say, My lady, a promise was made. And now, this most beautiful woman that e'er there was, she was angry.
And despite how it twisted her face, she was still that impossible beautiful that cast all other beauties as mere memories of its shadow. And Seamus was still fighting with himself not to fall to his knees and beg to stay with her, but fight he did. Promises? It was the only way he'd come, McQueen. His mother, her face was fully contorted now with rage. Go then, you will regret this. Take him, go, out of my sight. The sea dandy indicated to Seamus that now they really must leave, and Seamus turned, and as he did, he plucked his floating black-handled knife from the water. When they were nearly at the door of the throne room, he turned. The Queen smiled sweetly, thinking he'd changed his mind. Passions had won out. Just one thing, he said, still somewhat struggling with his decision to walk away. Just one thing I have to know. Whatever you wish, my darling. You say that the wave wasn't to kill me, and I believe you. But there were 2 others with me in that boat. What would have happened to them? She tried to hide it, but the horrible, sadistic smile that crossed her face so briefly, that smile would, for years to come, haunt his nightmares even more than the memory of his hands clasped to her bosom would haunt his dreams. And it told him everything he needed to know. As is the accepted tradition in storytelling, I shall not narrate the journey back. Seamus was very tired, perhaps he even slept on the horse. Certainly he slept when he arrived back. His mother had waited up for him, and he owed everything to her foresight, and he thanked her for it profusely. Neither shall I narrate for you his wedding. I don't have the details, and while I wish I could tell you that the marriage that followed, that marriage he had fought so hard for, when many might have chosen a different path, while I wish I could tell you that it was happy, that it was fulfilled, it was the very best of marriages, I don't know that I honestly can. I don't know anything about it, really, but I think there is little harm in assuming that it was, if not perfect, rather more than simply satisfactory. But that man who was getting married, he was changed in an emotional, inner life type of way, having truly seen a very different world, with one that very few humans experienced and one that even fewer returned to live their lives after having seen. But he was also changed in a more practical way. For word got around of what had happened. Not the details, but the broad strokes. And the advice he got was, do not go near the sea again. For the very best of the young fishermen in the village, that was difficult, especially with a new family to support. But he made his change, his wife, I assume, understanding. So he stopped being a fisherman, became something else instead, at a time when changing your profession wasn't quite as easy as it is now. Fewer transferable skills, less open university courses. But change it he did, and he kept away from the sea. For months, years, old enough to see his children begin to grow. But not so much time has passed that he has gotten to see their wedding days when we rejoin the story about where it began. And we're back now where I began the story. The sea packed unnaturally with fish, a bounty the people were never likely to see again. One that could change the fortune of the village, of Seamus's family, along with everyone they knew. Enough people had forgotten why it was he had foregone the sea all those years ago. Or they didn't care, or they didn't believe. If they had believed back then, time had done its usual trick of murkying the memory. It wasn't actually true, it couldn't be true, was it? And besides, it was all a long time ago. Look at him, on the shore, when there's fish to be got in. They had whispered, and he had heard them, and now he headed for the boat, stroking the black handle of his knife. Blade changed many a time over the years, but handle just the same. And out he went into the sea, into the mass of writhing bodies, fair throwing themselves at him they were. And he returned with a mighty catch, an easy catch. And the people were thankful, and he was emboldened. And a second time he went out and returned, and his worries dissipated. I do not know why she had waited so long to tempt him out so. Perhaps something to do with the exact agreement made with the mother. Though I think its terms were completed when he was returned safe and sound, these things have strange particulars that neither I nor Seamus are privy to. Perhaps time was passing differently for the Queen, and by those standards it was just mere minutes, perhaps countless other explanations. But she had not forgotten her desire, how he had escaped her. A mere mortal had stood up against her, her will had been denied, and that could not pass. That was not how the story could end. Even though by now her desire for him might have cooled. Perhaps especially if that was the case. Maybe now she just plain wanted revenge. But whatever she wanted, she knew how to get it. Sometimes the powerful and the wicked, they won. She knew exactly what fishermen wanted. And the third time Seamus stepped foot onto the boat to take to the water was the last time his foot ever touched dry land. The only thing of his to ever return from the waves was found the next day, a black-handled knife wrapped in seaweed and washed up on the shore. Right, there we go. Discussion section. Where to begin? First of all, I think just to say on a personal note that this is one of those stories that I've had in my mind to tell on this podcast for a very long while, as it was one I encountered at a relatively young age and was fascinated by. There are some story elements that just really resonate with me, and as per the first couple of podcast episodes I did, Thomas the Rhymer and Tam Lin, this also involves an otherworldly being seducing a mere mortal, or at least attempting to in this case. I apparently resonate with that idea for reasons I'm not going to dig too far into. Though, while there are definite analogies that can be drawn with the woman in this story and the elven queen, quite close ones if you want to really stretch them, the structure of this story is very different. It is a story that is short on motivations, particularly of its protagonist, though I sort of try to add some. Why exactly is he so good and sensible to resist her otherworldly allure? Why exactly does he throw the knife into the wave? Where is his bride to be in all of this? A notable absence in the tale. And I'm asking lots of questions, but not only do they not have answers in the original text, but in talking about this story, I think I have to make clear to you, very much so, that this is one of those tales which is my version of it. That's the one that you've been told. I have plucked and arranged the bits that appeal to me from the many different tellings of this tale that exist. For unlike Thomas the Rhymer and Tam Lin, where only a relative few versions exist, and those being quite similar to each other, this story has a great many varieties which are rather wildly different in the telling, and indeed which, while they have this fundamental core, they really change the nature of the tale being told. Before I go on further, I should also acknowledge that while there are these huge numbers of versions of the tale, when it comes to people writing about this story, well, there's not very many, and I rather owe quite a lot of my quote-unquote research to just one article. The Knife Against the Wave, a uniquely Irish legend of the supernatural, ? By Michael Ross in the journal Folklore from 1994. In many ways, I'm just rehashing the information from this article. Feel free to go read it, it's linked on my website. Of course, any errors in what I'm about to say now remain very much my own. As that article title suggests, this is a story which is, by and large, and I'm not actually going to go into Ross's comparison here, do read the article for that, but this is a story that is found basically only in Ireland, very widely dispersed down the west coast, all the way from Donegal to Kerry, where I set my version, a lot of the versions being recorded in Irish, with the west coast of course being a particularly Irish-speaking area, even to this day. Some 150 versions have been collected, a very large number for folktales like this, and particularly notable in that they have those significant differences between them. It's also interesting to note that this is only a recently collected tale, relatively speaking. I'm using it in a folklorist sort of way here. The first version written down is from 1896, and most versions collected were done so throughout the first half of the 20th century. While it feels like a very old tale, Ross notes that, quote, "the legend is absent from the numerous ancient manuscripts," unquote, which is a reference to the fact that many Irish folk tales, or at least their clear antecedents, can be found in medieval manuscripts, which is not the case with this one. This, of course, does not mean that it's relatively modern, though it could, of course. However, Ross certainly comes down against arguing that it can be too modern, and I'm just going to quote him in full here. Quote, "The legend is unusual in the extreme freedom with which tellers have drawn on motifs from across the entire spectrum of fairy lore, and in the willingness with which they have formed hybrids with other legend types. As a consequence of this extreme freedom, there are about 20 separate redactions, the boundaries of which are difficult to determine. Although the legend has only come to our attention quite recently and is still being recorded, it could hardly display such variety and sophistication unless it had undergone a long period of refinement at the hands of storytellers." Unquote. So what we probably have here is a much older story that survived orally for quite some time without being written down, which is the sort of thing I'm often very suspicious about and will warn you against. If it appears for the first time in 1950, there's a good chance it was written in about 1950, so it's nice to have a story like this, which is a bit different and probably genuinely was hidden from the written record for quite some time. Of course, the next thing to discuss is that extreme freedom that he refers to. Just a bit of a sidebar before we go into that though. When I did my episodes on the Irish fairies, the Aes She, touching on some stories of the She, I did not spend much, if any, time talking about the fairies and the sea. I may well have mentioned that the otherworld, though more usually linked to the She mounds and the fairy forts, sometimes was said to lie across the sea on islands far to the west. But even rarer, but still existent outside of just this story, there were sometimes She, possibly not named quite as such, magical beings who looked quite a lot like humans, who lived under the sea. Tír Fóhin, the land under wave, is the name sometimes given to this undersea otherworld. Often the stories about these beings cross over with those of the Merrow, that is, the mermaids, and also the Selkie-like beings that exist in Irish folklore, and there's not perhaps quite the distinction between Merrow, fairies, and even the drowned dead that our culture sort of brings to this today. By which I mean these beings and their tales intermingle with each other, though in this case the woman is more of a fairy kind, not a mermaid or a Selkie, much closer to a She. She is distant from the more violent man-eating mermaid tales. Nevertheless, she certainly drifts into that dead category in some of the many tellings of the tale. But now as we wander into talking about the variants, I should caution that she does not actually live beneath the sea in all variants of this tale. Though mostly she does raise a wave, occasionally a storm, on the ocean or a lake. Sometimes she can be found on an island, and I've come across a version where she is found on the edge of a road, and another version where the protagonist is carried through the air to where she is, the exact location not quite clear. The only real core elements that remain in all tellings that basically allow it to be identified as the same story is that there is a wave, almost always, that will sink a vessel. Its size varies from a little one-man boat to a huge sailing ship. A male protagonist throws something that destroys the wave, not even always a knife. That dispels the wave. Some time passes. Whatever is thrown ends up stuck in a woman, and he has to pull it out to save her. That really is about it, and there's a lot of variants that can happen. One thing that I found particularly jarring was that the black-handledness wasn't really that common in this tale. When I first read it, that was a version that I found, and I sort of assumed, as you do, that that was a crucial element. Turns out not to be the case, not even that common actually in tellings of this. Now, as I was saying before, it's not like every version is totally different. We don't have 150 versions. There are lots of shared tropes across the versions, but nothing really more across all of them. In a few variations, storytellers do leave out that she's doing it to get him. In one variant, she's actually drowning a whole load of people. This is actually the one that makes it into the first spoken language Irish film, only 11 minutes long, where this story is told. I've put that on my website. And in that version as well, it has the variation that he gets a reward at the end of it, which is a fairly common one as well. Sometimes that's luck, sometimes it's a gift, sometimes that gift comes with a little bit of a curse connected to it as well, especially if she's angry with him. But all of those sort of change what the story feels like. Just to give a couple more examples of things that really change it. In some cases, the woman is actually the protagonist's fiancé, who has herself been either drowned or taken by the folk of the deep, and with the wave, she's trying to reunite him with her. And he typically resists in those versions, in order to avoid joining her in a terrible fate, even though he does pull the knife out. Quite a different feel from the tale that I've told there. The ending indeed changes as well. Sometimes he ends up with the woman, sometimes even joyfully, though he definitely resists it on balance more. Sometimes the man is single, and we don't have the whole marriage sort of looming over him. And in that case, the woman in the sea isn't being quite as dastardly as she might be, where she's trying to steal him away from his earthly bride. Many other details shift as well. Sometimes he's rich, sometimes poor, sometimes it doesn't enter into it. Side characters appear and disappear. The location obviously changes depending on the county where it's told, but regardless of exactly how it works out, there are certain unifying themes to do with love and sex and restraint going on here, as well as the ocean setting. I'll quote one author, Angela Bourke, who's written extensively on Irish legends, who says that, quote, "The phallic connotations of the knife stuck in the sea woman's breast are obvious, as is the metaphorical significance of a narrative in which the strange woman's male relatives redress the injury done to her." Unquote. Which I think is very true and possibly does get to something at the heart of this story, though because it's changed so much, not all versions have it even stuck in her chest. Sometimes it's her eye, for instance. Many don't have the male relative trying to redress balance in quite the same way. However, the story does seem, in all cases, to have a relationship/sexual sort of message to it. As Bourke puts it, quote, "The rigid conventions of sexual morality and marriage custom wobble and bend when scrutinised through this legend." Which I think is a pretty good way of putting it, actually. And clearly I leaned into those themes in the version that I've just told you. My version of this tale was knitted together from a few versions I liked. I emphasised the mother a little bit more. Sometimes, possibly more often, the role of the advisor to the protagonist is played by a male relative or a crewmate. I also sort of leaned in to try and give him more reasons for resisting rather than just a sort of blank goodness, which in a lot of the tellings of the tale just isn't stated. He's doing the right thing and that's just sort of which I suppose is good, but it isn't stated as to why exactly the beauty of the woman doesn't attract him. So this means that you've heard a fairly unique version of this tale, but I would say that that itself is faithful to the nature of this tale being a tale that is changed a lot in the telling. So, it sort of works. And that rambling is where I will leave that today. Before finishing up, I do need to give special thanks to two people, Neil Phillip and Hog and Dice. Starting with Neil Phillip. If you haven't heard of Neil, he is a renowned author on English folklore, which is where I first encountered him, but well beyond as well, writing both fiction and factual books that I'm pretty sure will be of great interest to anyone listening. Have linked him on the website. I strongly recommend that you go and check out his extensive back catalogue for children and adults alike. He was kind enough to lend me his copy of Sean O'Connell's book, which is an absolutely amazing collection of folk tales from Sean O'Connell, an Irish storyteller, and which I was unable to find the English translation of anywhere because it's out of print. That has one of the key versions of this story in it, which is actually very different from the one I've just told now, but it was still great to get my hands on that book, and some more tales from it might be appearing on the podcast in future. Also, a shout out to Hog and Dice, who I've mentioned before, who helped me with some of the Irish pronunciations in this episode. They are a fantastic storyteller doing stuff on YouTube and Instagram. Very knowledgeable folklorist. I would recommend that you go and give them a follow too. Okay, so I'm not going to make any promises about when my next episode will be. I will, however, repeat what is rapidly becoming my mantra, that I am very committed to doing this podcast despite how it may appear, and that new episodes will continue to come out. Thank you to everyone who keeps commenting and reviewing and giving me feedback and even joining Patreon. You only pay when I make a Patreon episode, and that hasn't happened for a while, but I will be on that soon. If you haven't joined and you want more Tales of Britain and Ireland content, there's a back catalogue you can get caught up on. Thank you to Rolex, Farsus, Andrea Abler, Craig Tulloch and Kevin Sweetman for joining since the last episode. I will try and get you some content soonish. I should also mention, for those who it's relevant, I am occasionally doing live stuff. I'm guesting on some other podcasts here and there as well. In 2026, which is a long way away when I'm saying this, I'm hoping to do a much larger UK tour. Keep your eyes out for that if you are in the UK. If you're not, then hell, tell all your friends about the podcast, and maybe I'll just get big enough to do a States tour one day or something like that. Okay, that's about it for now. Next time we'll have a Scottish fairy tale with some even more interesting relationship dynamics going on in it, and some very irritating names that I still need to work out exactly what I'm doing with. I do hope that you will join me for that. You can follow Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads and Facebook. There's also a website, talesofbritainandireland.com, where there's a page for each episode which contains more information, including illustrations, asides and recaps, along with other additional bits and pieces to explore. The intro music was written and performed by Alice Nichols, and the outro music by Mitch Keeley and Josh Newman. And you can find all the other musical credits on the episode page on the website. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it with others or give it a review, as those really are the best ways to help us out. You can also join Tales of Britain and Ireland on Patreon to get extra members episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon.